This will be part 2. Sorry, we had a internet failure, and so we will continue with the lecture at this point. So we went over American wealth was accomplished by hard work and fair play. American society, a great melting pot of nations and races. Founders believe all men are created equal. Now, America was a true democracy and hated oppression. Well, democracy and participation in the government was very limited. Very limited. It was limited to white men over a certain age who owned property, which was a small minority of people in America. So this was not true democracy. This was almost like a facade of democracy. Might have been progressive, very progressive at the time, but it was not democracy, especially the way we think of it today. And it certainly wasn't democracy for those African people who were enslaved, the Native Americans who were prohibited from citizenship and participation in the running of the government of the United States, and of women who were completely excluded from the reins of government and having a say. Another myth, Africans were ignorant savages who did not have language, religion, culture, or wealth and came to America with nothing. It's called the deficit model of what the journey of Africans into America and into slavery. And you'll often hear African Americans, Black people, who say, you know what, I am so glad my ancestors were enslaved because I have Christianity and I live in this great land. That shows a lot of ignorance. Number one, there was the oldest church on earth is in Africa. Number two, that is not to, we should be careful not to denigrate and demean and minimize the spiritual traditions of anybody. If you're a Christian, great, but Africans had many complex spiritual systems, religions, and formed the root of what is now Christianity. Again, this is something that we'll cover later in the semester when we can see each other and we can talk about it. But to say that that Black people should be grateful for being ripped from their land converted to the use of European monarchs, their riches stolen, their culture destroyed, their people kidnapped and murdered. This is and demeaned to where they say they have nothing. Well, they had nothing after Europeans came. But when people had complex, peaceful societies, and they say, well, you know, the Europeans saved them from tribal wars. But the Europeans were having tribal wars at the same time and after. Wars of conquest, wars of imperial adventures where they were taking over the land of other peoples, wars of aggression. So that's something that that is a myth, that the Africans were saved from war. And you could say the same thing about Asians and Americans in terms of the indigenous people. So, and all of this is to say that when we talk about the United States and we talk about American political institutions, we can't talk in a vacuum, and we can't. We can't speak in terms of this mythology of who the Africans were and who the Europeans were, who the Native Americans were. So we're going to speak frankly, and again, when at this video, you can make comments. In class, you can make comments, and feel free to ask questions or give your own spin on it so we can discuss it. So everyone is straight. Native Americans, another myth. Native Americans were savages who brutally attacked colonists and scalped them because they were white. Well, Europeans, the descendants of Europeans, used to scalp Native Americans. And they didn't scalp them because they were white any more than Europeans enslaved Africans because they were black. If Native Americans attacked colonists, is because they were stealing their land. They were taking their land and injecting foreign concepts of ownership. Because, how do you own land? It's like, how do you own land? This is land that's joint. This is a collective experience. In both Africa and Native in the Americas, land was not to be owned by individuals so much. It was to be owned by the collective. Lived on and worked by the collective, because the land was apparently God's land or nature's land. It was not land for individuals. And then black people were enslaved and discriminated because of the color of their skin. Well, there are people in India just as dark as the people in Africa. The Native Americans are very dark originally. You have Asians, extremely dark. And then you have Africans who are fairly light. Some of the Khoisan people, extremely light. And then you have Europeans enslaving other Europeans. So it wasn't the color of their skin. If Europeans are enslaving other Europeans who had the same complexion, then that couldn't be the reason. The reason it was easier to justify the enslavement of people because there were physical differences, cultural differences, language differences, and military differences, because Africans had not yet acquired gunpowder, even though they had trade around the world, trade with Asia, India, China, trade and travels throughout the world before coming into contact with Europeans. This was not the reason because of the color of their skin. So there are those myths and more that we will cover during the semester, but I just wanted to get those out of the way. The nature of government. And there are flashcards within the Canvas. Pay attention to both the terms and the concepts that come up during these lectures. Whether it's a video lecture or live lecture, make notes. Again, extremely important to make notes. It's easier to understand, and when you're tested on it, you'll recall much easier if you have written it down. Okay, so What is the nature of government? A social institution that controls the behavior of people. It's a major mechanism for managing conflicts, controlling behaviors when people interact to maintain peace and order. So if there's no, now people say anarchy. Anarchy is not the absence of government, but it's the absence of authority of one over another. But can you imagine a society where people are unrestricted in their interactions with other people? There's enough problems with crime with police, which are part of the government. There's enough crime with, there's enough theft of land, as we saw in the Americas and elsewhere. So you have government of various kinds, of all kinds, putting controls on people so they won't take advantage. Now, sometimes government is designed to oppress the majority of people. Oftentimes, it's designed to oppress the majority of people. But it helps, the function of government is to control, for better or worse, for good or bad, and maintain peace and order. Sometimes to maintain chaos and confusion. So what are the functions of government? Providing security, serving the public good, managing and resolving conflict, and offering services. Now this is it's a very short list. It's not a exhaustive list of what the functions of government are. And this is the concept of government through, again, Western eyes. So it is incomplete, but it is a good base to go from. So types of government: a democracy, a system of government in which the people exercise political power. Well, again, this is the people. How do you define the people? In America, in white minorities, South Africa and Rhodesia, in other parts of the world, you had governments that called themselves democratic, but excluded large amounts of people. In the United States and other places, again, South Africa under their racist apartheid regime, they were called democracies and part of the Western tradition of democracy, but they excluded large numbers of people, particularly African people and other people of color. So the types of government, types of democracy: direct democracy, one person, one vote. People are able to participate directly in the decision-making process. And this is why you hear things like the People's Democratic Republic of Germany, or the People's Republic of China, and you say, but those are dictatorships. But they have some mechanism for people to participate within the governmental frame. And ultimately, they may not be able to move or remove or elect a government, and that might be restricted to, again, a certain class of people. But a direct democracy is when your vote counts, certainly, which is what we don't have here. What we have here is an indirect or representative democracy, a democracy in which people do not participate directly in decision making, but instead elect individuals to represent their interests. So here we have the Senate, the House of Representatives, excuse me, and the Electoral College. So when you're voting for president, you're not voting for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or whoever else is running. You're voting for electors. The reins of government are not within directly in your hands, but you have, as a citizen, as a participant in this democracy, you hand it over to someone else who represents your interest. And in presidential elections, it's the electoral college and the electors. In establishing laws, that's the Senate, that's Congress, and in two houses, the Senate and House of Representatives. Again, when we talk about types of government, we're only talking in this particular context of government in terms of the United States and in European tradition. Not even all kinds of government, because there's lots of kinds of government in terms of monarchies and authoritarian governments where there is, one party states. You have parliaments and this type of thing, but you have a constitution. When we talk about a constitution, what we have here is what they're talking about. And a constitution is a set of formal rules, written rules and principles governing a state. And a constitutional democracy is a government that derives its authority from a constitution. Vietnam, which has a communist government, has a constitution, and took a lot of its studied the U.S. Constitution as a model. One of the things that Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, although the United States government considered him a dictator, is that he made sure that everyone read the Constitution. They used to sell constitutions on the street. So he encouraged everyone to read their Constitution. Characteristics of constitutional democracies. And again, this is it's not fantasy, but it's kind of an idealist view of what a constitutional democracy is. But you must know this. Free elections with free political opposition, free press and media that operate independently of the government, regularly held elections and peaceful transitions of power, and protections for personal and civil rights. Now, again, if you look at the history and the structure of the United States, one of the glaring defects is the absolute ignoring of protection for personal civil rights for African Americans, Native Americans, and other people of color. There were certain protections, but it was not certainly not on par with the Europeans. So these are ideal characteristics of constitutional democracies. But to say that every constitutional democracy does these things, well, I suppose they're saying, well, as long as they do it for a certain portion of the people, then that makes it so. But not entirely true all the time. The principles of constitutional democracies: the rule of law, the predominance of law over discretionary authority. And this is one of the issues that President Trump is having now, because some people believe, and it appears he believes, that he has, the government is to serve him. And his attorney general was to serve him, and the FBI director is to serve him. At least that's how some people interpret his actions. Natural law comes from nature and is superior to statutory law, along with natural rights, rights to which every person is entitled, such as life and liberty. Those rights are not dependent on government. So law coming from nature is superior to statutory law. The right of when you say you have the rights, the right to self-defense, the right to travel, a lot of rights, right to earn a living. These are things that uh, come from nature, to feed yourself and your family, to shelter yourself and your family. So I'm going to briefly run through foundations of American government. Then I think we're going to, let me see, where are we? Yeah, foundations of American government. So we're going to go over this, and then we're going to quit for this session. But 5 characteristics of classical republicanism. Republicanism believes in virtuous citizenry. Republicanism is concerned with property. Republicanism sees the people as the ultimate authority, but believes they must be kept at a distance. Republicanism advocates a distribution of power across branches of government, and Republicanism believes that the rights of individuals must be protected. And I'm sure you understand by now, especially if you've done the reading, Republicanism does not mean the Republican Party. The Republican Party got its name from the concept of republicanism. So virtuous citizenry. So people should be virtuous. People should be good. People should do good, and not be evil, not be so greedy and vile and violent. Virtuous, good people. Is concerned with property. This is why at the beginning of this country, they said, well, people can vote, but you have to be white, male, and own property and over a certain age. So this owning of property was very important. Sees the people as ultimate authority, but believes they must be kept at a distance. Well, besides having a very small minority, at least in the American scheme of things, they said those few people who could vote and participate in the democracy still could not control the government, but to give the reins of power to representatives. Republicanism advocates a distribution of power across branches of government. So you have different branches of government. And in the United States, we have those 3: legislative, executive, and judicial. So this distribution of power prevents one branch of government being more powerful than the other, and then the other, there are checks and balances. And republicanism believes in the rights of individuals, that the rights of individuals must be protected. And this is why we have the Bill of Rights, because this is a Republican form of government, and to ensure that people have rights, individuals have rights. So the king can't come and say, I'm going to take your land, or take your spouse or your children, force them into servitude. That was someone messaging. The individual rights must be protected. And again, this is an ideal. And remember, this is a class about a Black perspective, so this has not always been enforced in terms of Black people, people of African descent, and other people of color. So I'm going to end it here and pick up for Thursday. There will be, we will finish chapter 1.